If you Google information about the great city of St. Louis, Missouri, you will find a lot of articles about its decline, its social problems, racial problems, and marginality. To give you an idea of where it stands today, with each passing year, St. Louis loses about 1% of its population. Granted, we're not talking about the most thriving city in the US. This has been the trend for the last 6 years, and you know what? There is no indication that this will turn around in the short term.
Report: St. Louis is America's fastest shrinking city. St. Louis Business Journal.
But wait a minute, because St. Louis was not always like this. We are talking about what was once the most important city west of the Mississippi River, and one of the richest, most flourishing and economically active cities in the United States. A very prosperous place that was also one of the most important cultural and artistic hubs in the country. It was a much larger and more important city than some of the great metropolises of the United States today. Shout out to Chicago. You'll see why later. This is the other side. The less well-known face of a city that, for a time, was one of the brightest spots in the United States of America. St. Louis was founded by the French in 1764 and was then acquired by the US government as part of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Thanks to its incorporation into the Union, its privileged location along the Mississippi River, and its role as a bridge between the founding states and the Southerners, by 1818, the city had become a communications center. This was largely thanks to the merchant ships that plied the waters of the Mississippi from there. 3 years later, in 1821, Missouri acquired statehood. In the following years, the city experienced an explosion of prosperity that multiplied both its economic and demographic growth. So much so that by 1860, only a century after its founding, the city had already surpassed 150,000 inhabitants, and in the following 10 years, its population doubled again to over 300,000. And although these figures may seem small to us today, believe me when I tell you that, at that time, 300,000 people was the equivalent to a city of several million inhabitants today. In this way, St. Louis became one of the major US centers of the professional services industry, such as finance and advertising. In fact, 8 Fortune 500 companies are still based there. But hold on a minute, because nowadays, things are very different. For example, St. Louis has the second highest violent crime rate in the entire country, behind only Detroit. In St. Louis, 1 in 51 people were victims of a violent crime during 2020 alone. In fact, this same year, 2020, St. Louis was also considered one of the 10 most dangerous cities in the world, according to the Citizen Council for Public Safety and Criminal Justice, a Mexican organization that publishes an annual ranking of the most violent cities according to the number of homicides, a metric in which St. Louis is number 1 in the United States. But high crime rates are not the only thing that St. Louis shares with Detroit, a city that we've already covered in a video that I'll link for you in the description. They also share high rates of marginality and racial exclusion. But stop, that's as far as it goes. We are not going to dedicate this video to the St. Louis of today. At the end of the day, with the data that we have in hand, I think we can all get a pretty clear idea of how things are going. So what we want to do this time is to talk to you about something a little bit different. Something for which we have to go back a few years in time. Back in the 19th century, 2 cities not too far away from each other were competing hand in hand to become the most important commercial hub. One was, obviously, St. Louis, and the other, Chicago. But while Chicago is now a thriving megacity, St. Louis is nothing more than a small to medium-sized city, riddled with problems and suffering from extremely high rates of building abandonment and lots of crime. And the question is, what the hell happened to make St. Louis fall from grace and Chicago rise with the stars? What exactly made the difference? Well, let's find out. But just a moment. Before I continue, I'd like to tell you something. As you know, VisualPolitik's mission is to let you know the events that explain the news, what is hidden behind the big headlines. And you are a fundamental part of our being able to continue growing and improving. Just being there week after week, on the other side of the screen, and also for the help that many of you give us on Patreon. A Patreon that, by the way, we've dusted off to give it life and make it become a real hub of the community. That's why, in addition to the exclusive content for patrons that we already have in place, such as our weekly snapshots or the extra videos that we provide, we will also launch surveys and periodic questionnaires in which, for example, you can choose topics for future videos or send us your questions. We've also prepared exclusive products that will never be available for sale. They are designs exclusive to Patreon. So if you want to be part of VisualPolitik, you can do it by joining our Patreon team. We'll leave a link below where you'll find more information. And with that said, let's get back into today's video.
victim of itself and of bad luck.
Take a close look at this chart. Today, St. Louis has a population of less than 300,000, specifically about 294,900. In 1870, it had 310,000 people. Wait, it had more inhabitants in 1870 than it does right now? Well, yes, that's right, and it's not a mistake. In fact, its peak population was reached a long time ago, in the 1950s, when the city surpassed 850,000 inhabitants, and since then, St. Louis has lost almost 70% of its population. And evidently, this is not the natural evolution of a city, nor is it something common. It is something truly rare, surprising, and unusual. But to understand the roots of this story, we have to go back to the 1850s. That was when St. Louis and Chicago, two cities relatively close and with direct river access to Midwestern settlements, began to compete fiercely. We're talking about a time in history when St. Louis was a much larger and much more important city than Chicago. Chicago, in 1850, had barely 30,000 inhabitants. At that time, St. Louis was the epicenter of north-south trade, a trade that was done primarily via steamboats along the Mississippi River. Yes, we're talking about those famous ships that appear in period movies. Well, due to its geographic position, St. Louis was the northernmost city that was connected by a direct natural waterway to New Orleans, the southern states, and the Caribbean. For its part, Little Chicago had New York as its main trading partner and port of entry and exit to foreign countries at that time. But I think it's fair to say that St. Louis was a city used to being in the right place, but not at the right time throughout history. Or put another way, it has never quite had the right elements. This is a story of how conformism, bureaucracy, lack of dynamism, and little ambition brought down one of the great cities of the Western world. But let's not get sidetracked. The fact is that in 1848, this city received its first major blow. That year, the canal connecting the Great Lakes directly to the Mississippi River, which, as you know, laps the shores of St. Louis, was completed. And which city is located on the shore of the Great Lakes? Lake Michigan in particular? That's right, Chicago. So you can imagine that this milestone was extremely important for the city of the deep dish pizza. For the first time, Chicago was in a privileged position. Suddenly, the small city on the edge of the Great Lakes had access to river trade with the southern United States. And not only that, from Chicago, it was also possible to trade with present-day Canada, and it provided better connections with the East Coast, especially with New York. So, as you can imagine, this caused St. Louis to lose one of its strongest advantages, since thanks to its position in the middle of the Mississippi, it had been, until then, a unique place for trade with the southern states, especially with the emerging city of New Orleans, which the Mississippi flows to. Of course, completion doesn't have to be a problem, unless you don't want to face it. Let me explain. In tandem to the development of the canal, the first railroad projects began to be implemented in the two cities, although at very different speeds. As you see, at that time, it was considered that the railroad would help expand the area of influence of cities that had developed thanks to natural transportation routes, such as the Mississippi. The railroad allowed many counties to have access to the great waterways, thus pushing the growth of these states, and particularly of these great cities, of these great logistic hubs. However, despite being a much larger city with many more resources than Chicago, St. Louis, its authorities, and its big businessmen were completely focused on the Mississippi River. This attitude was largely the reason for the slower pace of getting railroad projects off the ground. In some ways, the train was viewed with some suspicion because of competition, and because its importance was not appreciated. The city didn't need it. So while in Chicago, they were supporting, promoting, and building new rail infrastructure, in St. Louis, the plans were still on paper. Everything was slower. To top it all off, 1861 arrived, the year in which the Civil War exploded in the United States. And remember a moment ago, we commented that much of St. Louis' commerce was tied to New Orleans and the southern states. Well, the problem is that when the Civil War broke out, commercial ties with those secessionist states were cut off, leaving St. Louis without its greatest economic asset, and above all, within easy reach of the rival side. So of course, at that time, Chicago, which is located quite a bit further north, was considered a safer place, which is why it became very prominent during the 4 years of the Civil War, and also during the post-war period. The Civil War propelled Chicago ahead of St. Louis as the benchmark industrial powerhouse, which was also accompanied, logically, by more investment in infrastructure, and yes, huge population growth as well. By 1890, Chicago had more than double the population of St. Louis and had surpassed 1 million inhabitants. And that was despite the fact that just 40 years earlier, it was no more than a large town of about 30,000 inhabitants. So St. Louis lost its position. The decline of the main trade route and the comparatively minor development of its railroad gradually caused the city to fall behind the major North American cities. And while St. Louis did continue to grow over the years, it never again shone as it once did. But remember that we're talking about what was once one of the most important cities in the country, a city that was practically on the same level as New York. However, when we looked at the population graph earlier, what we find is a huge decline since the city reached its peak population level in the 1950s. So what on earth has happened since then? What caused a drop of almost 70% in the number of inhabitants? What has led it to become one of the 10 most dangerous cities in the world? Listen up.
Detroit 2.0.
As I was telling you at the beginning of this video, the paths of St. Louis and Detroit have become quite similar. After losing the battle against Chicago, we could almost say that the next rival was Detroit. The city that was then the jewel of the automobile industry in America had competition. By the beginning of the 20th century, St. Louis and the surrounding area had already become the second largest automobile producing region in the United States, just behind, of course, Detroit. In fact, it is said that the first gas station in the entire country was started here in St. Louis, and it is also said that this was the site of the first traffic accident. Of course, I'm not sure what part of all of this is truth or legend. The fact is that industrialization caused both cities to receive an enormous amount of immigration from the southern United States, especially the African American population. The Great Migration was a massive migratory phenomenon that moved 6 million African Americans from the southern states to the northern, eastern, midwestern, and western states of the country. The difficult economic conditions and the harsh racial segregation experienced in the southern United States made many African Americans want to seek a better future in the industrialized cities of the north. Among those cities was St. Louis. St. Louis seemed to regain its momentum. The city experienced a real estate boom, and in 1904, it even hosted the St. Louis World's Fair and the Olympic Games. Yes, both events in the same year and in the same city. The problem is that the city repeated practically the same mistakes of the second half of the 19th century. Lack of diversification and progressive paralysis. There was practically nothing but the automobile industry, and when it began to have problems, everything fell apart. The process was exactly the same as we told you about in the case of Detroit. You have the video linked in the description. The crisis hit the city, and employment multiplied. Crime became commonplace, and many middle-class people began to escape by moving to the suburbs. St. Louis began to be dominated by abandoned buildings, dangerous no-go zones, crime, and lots of narcotics. The whole cocktail. This is precisely why St. Louis is known as Detroit 2.0. The second Detroit that very few people talk about and that faces problems today almost as serious as those of the northern city in Michigan. A store brand Detroit that has a future as complicated as the original. A city that was once of the shining stars of American power and that today struggles to get ahead and has been converted into one of the most dangerous cities in the world. So at this point, the question is, can St. Louis be reborn and once again become a thriving place full of dreams for people seeking to improve their lives? Will this city have another chance to flourish and regain the magic it once had? Leave us your opinion below in the comments. And if you like the video, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss anything that's coming up. And once again, thanks again for being here. All the best, and see you in the next one.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.